Hello everybody on YouTube. So I'm going to do a big video today on my home computer rather than my usual ones going out for my little walks. Hopefully the quality's good enough for you guys. Anyway, so wanted to do about David Warner's captaincy ban. So I reported on this at the time in 2018. A lot of people loved my insights, but a lot of other people disputed the accuracy of it. And as time has gone on, it's become a bit more obvious to people that I was right the whole way through. So, I mean, I wish people would just trust me a bit more, but perhaps they need to get used to just how accurate I am with these sorts of things. But I just want to go over this again and really put this into perspective. I'm not really just here to tap myself on the back. I really wish that at the time people had listened to me and that we'd done the right thing because we clearly didn't. And we particularly didn't do the right thing as far as David Warner is concerned. So I want to go back to it. So in March of 2018, Australia were in a test series in South Africa. Now, Australia have a pretty good record in South Africa. South Africa is not one of these teams that's wonderful at home. They actually play better away. They have the worst um, comparative home ground advantage. They have the lowest home ground advantage. I think Pakistan is the second worst. So Pakistan haven't even hosted for a number of years, but even proper Pakistan, as opposed to Sharjah, isn't really much of an advantage for them. So South Africa's a very fair place to play, and so Australia were hoping to win, but then they were losing, and it had been a very controversial tour, particularly to do with David Warner, because one of his wife Candace Warner's boyfriends had been alleged to have been with Candace while she was married to David Warner, and there are a lot of people that were wearing these masks that pretended that teasing David Warner, trying to get him upset. And some of the players from South Africa had gone along with this. So this was the context. We had AB de Villiers was one, and I think it was Kagiso Rabada, and I hope I've said his name correctly. That was another. And Kagiso Rabada was actually banned from from the third test. He wasn't allowed to compete based on attacking David Warner. But then on appeal, well, he didn't actually win the appeal, but they just never enforced the ban. So Kagiso Rabada was able to play, and that made David Warner really furious. There was also the issue of ball tampering, and South Africa had tried to get Australia in trouble for ball tampering in that test. They were really angry because one of the umpires had called a number of South Africa's bowlers for running on the pitch, and it wasn't quite your banned for ball tampering level, but they were in trouble. The umpires were against them, and the South African players, media, and everybody felt like, well, this is a home ground. We're not getting any home ground advantage. Surely we should get the benefit of the doubt. We're not really tampering the ball, and there was a bit of a view in South Africa that all the ball tampering accusations always seem to be against them. Faf de Plessis was often accused and well, found guilty. I think Wayne Parnell was another one. And now they had three players, three bowlers. So basically their entire bowling contingency were warned. Not they weren't well they might have been banned. Um, this was before the Cameron Bancroft thing. They were at risk of being banned. So what we had was that the South African media contingent actually tried to frame Australia for ball tampering. So South Africa were not, I mean, they weren't found guilty. They were warned by the umpire. So a bit of a different level. So it's a bit of a lower level. And then they had all this video footage of Mitchell Starc and Pat Cummins, so who's now the Australian captain, who were both shown to be doing pretty similar things to what the South African bowlers were doing, which was running on the pitch, running their feet over the ball, deliberately throwing the ball into the pitch and trying to rough it up. And the question was, is that illegal? And a number of newspapers said, well, it is. These guys are ball tampering. And we're not, they didn't want people to know that they'd actually been accused by the umpire. So it was a bit of this whole politics of, oh, we're not doing anything wrong because you guys are doing something wrong. So that was the background. And we also had that teasing about David Warner. It was really quite nasty about the whole thing. And then the cameraman, and we know that this happened, the South African cameraman from the local TV station were asked, please try to frame Australian players for ball tampering. And they weren't really expected to find anything substantial. It was all gossip, muckraking nonsense. And then they found something. They really weren't expecting to find anything. And they found Cameron Bancroft with sandpaper in his hand. And they were like, what? We actually found something. They put it on the big screen. Just like, hey, we're not cheaters, you guys are cheaters. And the umpires went, oh, okay, what is this? And Cameron Bancroft, as we now know, said to the umpires, well, he pulled out a black felt sunglasses case and said, hey, this is what I was using. But he was actually told by Darren Lehman, the coach, before that, via the 12th man, Peter Hanscom, who came running out onto the pitch. So they showed it up on the screen. Peter Hanscom came, well, so they showed up on the screen. That was the first thing. And then Darren Lehman was the coach, was like, oh, no, 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 no. And then he, on his walkie-talkie to Peter Hanscom, the cameras were then going, what? We know what you're doing. And so Lehman was going, oh, no, no, not doing that. And, whew, whew, sorry. Sorry about that. Anyway, so step one on the screen. Soon after that, Peter Hanscom's going, and he's going, oh, geez, the cameras are showing me. So he's covering his face. Peter Hanscom's going to, oh, and then he's covering his face too. They didn't want to be involved. They're like, we haven't done anything. We're just required to do this. And then we saw Peter Hanscom run onto the ground, talk to Bancroft, and then Bancroft got the bit of sandpaper and just threw it down his pants, threw it in your underpants. And then when the umpires came a couple of minutes later and said, hey, what is this? We've seen what looks like sandpaper on the screen. And he's pulled out a black felt sunglasses case. So, of course, what that looks like is that Darren Lehman tried to cover it up. And I'd say he did. I would say the evidence is Darren Lehman saw it, went, no, we're not getting in trouble for this. Told Peter Hanscom, who told him to cover it up. And so Cameron Bancroft covered it up. So, because of that, it made the ball tampering worse. So if you get the first stage of ball tampering, so it's usually, you can get a warning, you can get a 1 match ban, you can get a 2 match ban. So what the bowlers were getting, so the South African bowlers, was a warning. They got a warning. They weren't facing a ban. It might have led to a 1 match ban, maybe. At the end of the test, they might have assessed it and they might have said, hey, you guys, at least 1 or 2 of you are getting a ban. Would have been a 1 match ban because it was pretty low level. Equally, the Australian bowlers may have ended up with a 1 match ban after they'd reviewed it all. So talking about Mitchell Starc and Pat Cummins. Josh Hazlewood was also playing. He wasn't accused. So you potentially could have had 5 bowlers, so 3 South African and 2 Australian, all facing 1 match bans. But what Cameron Bancroft did was a higher level. So he wasn't on the not sure if it's a warning or a ban sort of thing. He was on the definite ban. This was obvious. This was sandpaper. So he was probably looking at a 2 match ban because sandpaper is a bit more significant than just running on the pitch, which you could say, oh, that's an accident. It's an accident to run on the pitch. It's not an accident to bring out a bit of sandpaper. Now, some people said, well, the sandpaper doesn't actually scuff it up that much. Maybe it does not. I'm not really an expert on that, but it's more deliberate. It's more obvious. It's more blatant. And I think this is the thing. Like, if you look at all the sandpaper, so not, all the ball tampering situations we've had over the years, most of them have been sort of tricky. They've been lollies, they've been sweat, they've been all that sort of thing. They've been where they can pretend it wasn't really ball tampering, and there's a sort of art some people have talked about, and we've had Michael Atherton say, "Oh, you can tamper with the ball and get away with it if you do it cleverly." This wasn't clever. This was amateur hour. This was, if those 5 bowlers, 3 South African and 2 Australian, were looking at that, they'd be like, "What? You're never going to get away with that." And then producing the felt sunglasses case. No. So that's where it becomes a bit of a question because you might say, okay, if it's blatant, do you face a bigger penalty because it's so blatant or a lower penalty because it's always going to be caught? And I guess we can compare it with Shahid Afridi biting the ball. She did in a 1 day match. It was 2009 maybe. And he got a 1 match ban and he said, oh, I was just joking. I was just showing that everyone's cheating and I'm not a cheater. And so he bit the ball. I think it was something along those lines. And it was that sort of level. And so there was an argument to only give Cameron Bancroft 1 match because it was so obvious. But there was also an argument to give it 2 matches because it was so obvious and there was no excuse for it. And it was so clearly deliberate. So in the other ones, there was the chance that it was an accident. So if you're talking about what Mitchell Starc did in that match, what Pat Cummins did in that match, what I think it was Wayne Parnell, Kagiso Rabada, I can't remember what the other bowler was, but yeah, that was all potentially accidental. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. We're not sure if it was really ball tampering, if it passed that threshold. The 3 South Africans were warned. And that was the thing. When the South Africa's coach was asked about it, he said, "Oh, I thought we were the ones in trouble." He thought that his bowlers were the ones being found guilty of ball tampering. He was shocked when he found out it was Australia's. It wasn't just Australia's bowlers; it was a fielder. This just made no sense. And the fact that he lied to the umpire so blatantly with the black sunglasses case, and then with the additional support of Darren Lehman and Pete Hanscom meant that there was a bit of culpability there. This wasn't just an accident. This wasn't just it was beyond. It was beyond just, oh yeah, he's scuffing up. And it was pretty clear that Mitchell Starc and Pat Cummins, who were doing it really subtly, possibly legally, who knows, they had no idea that Cameron Bancroft was being so blatant. So they were furious that he was doing that. And and then you've got the coach trying to cover it up. And the 12th man go on there, on camera, trying to cover it up. And then he does cover it up. So it went from possibly one, possibly two, to having to be 4 tests that he'd be banned for. And then we got to the press conference, and Steve Smith said, "Oh, it was sticky tape." Well, it wasn't sticky tape. It was sandpaper. He said, "Oh, I've got sticky tape and roughed it up on the thing." Went from a 4 match ban to an 8 match ban. And the ICC didn't know what to do. And so they gave them both 1 match bans for Steve Smith and for Cameron Bancroft. And then Cricket Australia said, "No, we're going to handle this." Because, and I think we've got to be realistic here, Cameron Bancroft was lying and then lying and then lying. So he told 3 different versions of the truth by then. Now, the first one to the second one, you could blame Darren Lehman for. So the first one, maybe somebody told him to cheat. I mean, we already had Starc and Cummins cheating. We already had South Africa cheating. So perhaps he just decided to cheat a bit more. And that's Steve Smith revealing that. Probably shouldn't have, but no, I don't think he was lying. And yeah, and then we had 3 different versions. So the first version, perhaps he misunderstood what the bowlers were doing. So the bowlers were quite subtly cheating, quite borderline, maybe not quite cheating. Bancroft doesn't appear to have been ordered to do this, and why would he do it so blatantly? If it was going to do it on order, he would be doing it a lot more subtly. He'd be just very carefully. Oh, plausible deniability. He did it blatantly, and that blatant thing says nobody told him to do it. And there's simply no evidence anyone told him to do it. So certainly not David Warner. And I know there were the claims that David Warner had been cheating using some bandage on his hand, and he might have been. I'm not saying he definitely wasn't, although that's not really in Warner's character. But if he was, that's more subtle. This was more blatant. This was sandpaper. Nobody in the history of cricket has used something as blatant as that to tamper with a ball. So it needed to have, and then with all the cover up, so the Darren Lehman sunglasses case, and then the Steve Smith interview, sticky tape, you needed to have a significant time out of the gate. So based on that, and based on the evidence that we know about, these are the penalties we should have had. Cameron Bancroft, 1 year ban. Steve Smith, 1 match ban and a 1 year captaincy ban. Darren Lehman sacked as coach. Pete Hanscom, don't think he really did anything wrong. He was following orders, but perhaps a fine. That's it. That's what should have happened. 1 year. Now, then we get to the next level of this. This is when it gets really nasty. Because in the dressing room, now David Warner had not been mentioned to this point, but in the dressing room, we know Mitchell Starc stood up after they were all discussing it, And after David Warner, in the middle of David Warner talking, Mitchell Starc stood up and said, "Hey, I don't want to be in the same team as David Warner ever again." And we know what David Warner was saying too, which was saying, you all knew about this. So why does David Warner get banned for saying that you all knew about it? Because Mitchell Starc said he didn't want to be in the same team as him. And if you put that into the context of Mitchell Starc actually doing a little bit of ball tampering himself, you then sort of understand that Mitchell Starc was self-preservation. He was worried that he might get, well, he knew that Cameron Bancroft was going to get a year ban, which he deserved. So he was like, oh, I don't want to get a year ban. I did something very minor that maybe gets a one-match ban, maybe gets a warning, maybe gets nothing. Maybe it was still legal. He didn't want to be in that picture. So that was the motivation for Mitchell Starc. And he blamed David Warner because he has hated David Warner for several years before that. And we know David Warner had punched or was going to punch Joe Root earlier on because he thought that Joe Root was making fun of Hashim Amla when he actually wasn't. And David Warner said a lot of stupid things in social media. He's a hothead, but he's never been a liar. He's been blunt, too honest, which can be a problem. Being too blunt, too aggressive, but definitely not a liar, definitely not someone that would do this. And that's the thing. Mitchell Starc has been a liar. He has, I mean, he's not necessarily a bad person, but he has been known to lie. And ball tampering, well, Mitchell Starc may have been doing it for some time. And I don't know how long Pat Cummins had been doing it, but there was Pat Cummins doing it with him. And they talked about that later, and we sort of hush hush because we don't want Australia to look worse compared to the rest of the world because the rest of the world seems to be doing similar things. And there's all this debate that goes around that says, well, ball tampering shouldn't really be a crime because this sort of thing, it's okay. It's not. It's been going on for 50 years, for the whole time. You're allowed to shine the ball. You're allowed to scuff it up. This is just going perhaps a little bit further. So we have all that debate. Mitchell Starc didn't want to get himself a one-match ban, and he was worried because the level of what Cameron Bancroft had done, he knew warranted a serious penalty, not just one match. He was looking at 1 year. And there was a fear from Mitchell Starc, and oddly not from Pat Cummins. Pat Cummins seemed fine with taking whatever penalty came his way. But Mitchell Starc was like, no, I do not want to take that penalty. He doesn't even want one match ban. He didn't want it to look like he was a part of Bancroft's thing. And so he threw David Warner under the bus. So then we suddenly had David Warner not only getting a penalty that was completely undeserved, but getting the worst penalty of the lot. So Steve Smith, who rightfully had a one-match ban, suddenly was upgraded to a year for no reason. David Warner, who had no penalty at all and had no involvement in any of this, was suddenly pushed up to a year because of Mitchell Starc's threats, essentially. And both of them. Now, Steve Smith rightfully was banned from captaincy for a year. I think I completely agree with that side of things. But then David Warner was also banned and for life. What? So if we assess this now, and we assess that at that stage, the correct penalties of what we should have had, knowing what we know now, Cameron Bancroft's still a year out of the game, and it's just be for international cricket. Steve Smith should have had one match and a year captaincy ban. David Warner should have had nothing, and Mitchell Starc, because he lied, should have had two matches. Darren Lehman also should have lost the job as coach. He should have been sacked. There's all these different things. If they were being fair, that's what they would have done. Mitchell Starc perverted the course of justice. He manipulated things. But that's not the end of it. Because you see, after that, Cameron Bancroft started lying like crazy. So he'd lied a little bit to start with. And you could kind of understand it, but, self-serving. All that. Now he just made up all sorts of stuff against the bowlers, against Warner, against Smith, more against Warner, against all sorts of people, blah, 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 blah. So during his 1 year or 9 months ban, because he got off lightly, so Bancroft's penalty was less than it should have been. But during that time, the comments that he made and the inconsistencies and the absolute lying and trashing of Australia's good name in cricket should have warranted a life ban. So I would think what should happen now is that Cricket Australia reevaluate it and say, righto, number one, number one, Cameron Bancroft, life ban from international cricket. I'm not saying from state cricket. He can go and play in whatever he wants to at state level. If they're happy with him, they're happy with him. But life ban from playing internationals, whether it's tests, one days, T20s, whatever it is, life ban. Now, he could potentially redeem himself, but he'd have to confess to the whole thing, take responsibility, and, apologise for everything and really prove that he's not a complete deceitful jerk that he appears to be. And in which case, I think you could commute it to maybe 5 years. But I would put a life ban on there at the moment. Not for the ball tampering, but for all the dishonesty and just for putting everybody under the bus. Steve Smith obviously only should have had a one match ban, and having a year out of the game was extremely excessive. And I think I saw that there was an amount of income that he lost from IPL and the like, and it was around the $6 million mark. So I think Cricket Australia should compensate him $6 million, or whatever that amount is. Should get that compensation. They can do a calculation. They do that. They apologise and officially undo that penalty and make it one match and a year of captaincy. Officially remove the ban from playing cricket because that was completely uncalled for. One match was fair. David Warner should be exonerated. Now, I know some people will say, but didn't David Warner force Cameron Bancroft to do it? Well, there was no evidence of that. And even if he did, let's look at every other case. We've never had anybody else ever punished for asking someone to tamper with the ball. And you've got to be realistic here. If you're having batsmen tampering with the ball, somebody's asked them to do it. So some bowler or someone has encouraged that, whatever. So, and the idea that it came from David Warner, it wouldn't have. It would have come from someone like Mitchell Starc or Pat Cummins or one of the bowlers. It wouldn't have come from David. Well, David Warner was only a vice captain. He had no real influence. He was the backup. Vice captain is a token position. It's only comes into effect if the captain ends up injured or something, and even then sometimes they get somebody else to come in. So David Warner had no real power, and of course a lot of people didn't like him because he was a bit too honest, a bit too blunt, a bit too brutal. So yeah, David Warner is owed an apology. Absolutely owed a massive apology from Cricket Australia, and in turn encourage the fans to owe him that. And it shouldn't really matter. Like, he's not going to be Test captain. That's not going to happen. Pat Cummins is fine. But in the ODI and T20 arenas, there is the potential to put Warner in. Now, I know he's nearing retirement age, but he's still going strong. I said, no problem. If Warner loses his Test place, that's irrelevant. And I don't think he will, because there's really not any openers going around at the moment who can compete. I mean, we do have, what's that guy's name? The one that keeps getting concussed, that could come in, and he's pretty much it. So if David Warner lost a lot of form, more than he has been, then we could have forgotten his name, concussion guy, come in as long as he's dealt with his concussion, which I don't think he has. So it's not like there's anyone else knocking on the door. So you'd have to move Cameron Green into open or shuffle people around and all that sort of thing. And there's no real batsman just jumping up and down saying, "Hey, let's come in." So it's not a situation where David Warner's place should be in much doubt. Um, Certainly not in ODIs, which he's much stronger at the shorter formats. So there is certainly scope to make Warner the captain of either one or both of the ODI or T20 teams. In fact, if you were looking at, I mean, in ODIs, yes, you could probably put Travis Head in. Pat Cummins has said he doesn't want to lead in all three formats. And in fact, Pat Cummins isn't really T20 level. He's just not very good at that format. So, he doesn't make the team on merit. So, and he barely makes it in ODIs. Now, he's good, absolutely should be the Test captain. But, they're different formats for a reason. And I mean, if you look at the T20s, yes, Aaron Finch is leading. Aaron Finch has been one of Australia's best players. The only two others that have been consistently at that level are David Warner and Glenn Maxwell. So they're really the only three choices for T20 captain. ODIs, we've got a much better side, and there's a number of other options, and I don't think we need David Warner in there. But in T20s, there's every chance that David Warner legitimately should be captain at this stage, and even if it's only for a few months, even if it's only for a year, and even if he doesn't become captain, because that should be a meritorious approach, having the captaincy ban removed would mean that he gets to captain the Sydney Thunder, and it's a token move if nothing else. It doesn't necessarily have to be a practical thing. But I would also think that he's owed perhaps a bit more than Steve Smith is, and perhaps more like $10 million. I don't know the exact calculations. I think that's up for lawyers and other people to work out, but certainly he should never have been punished. And why was he punished? It was based on what Mitchell Stark said and what one of the journalists who said, "Oh, I've got inside information." That was it. There was no real evidence at any stage. There was never a confession. There was never an admission. There was never anything that proved it. Certainly nothing that was made public. And I mean, that's the thing. Yes, I would love to have seen a public trial. I can understand David Warner not wanting to see it, and his wife doesn't want it. And why doesn't his wife? I'd suspect because this gets back to all that stuff about at least two members of the South African team at the time, AB de Villiers and Kagiso Rabada, but also a lot of the fans teasing him about his wife potentially cheating on him. And he doesn't want to go through that. And she doesn't want him to go through that. And if he loses and stays out of the captaincy role, well, that's fair enough. But I think that we're seeing enough now to know that this was a bad decision at the time. Darren Lehman got away with it. And look, could we say that Darren Lehman did the wrong thing? Absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I don't think Darren Lehman was a part of the ball tampering. Well, who knows? But there's no absolute evidence of that. But he certainly was a part of the cover up. What Darren Lehman should have done is gone, oh, there's ball tampering there by one of our players. Oh, this is awful. And report it straight away to the third umpire, to the match referee. Just said, look, I had no part of this. There was no reason for him to talk to Peter Handscomb or for Peter Handscomb to go on the pitch. That looks guilty. So, at a bare minimum, Darren Lehman had a error of judgment, and he should have lost his job as coach over that. Now, yeah, so simply put, if they do nothing else, they need to remove David Warner's captaincy ban. I would go further than that, and I would completely exonerate him. I would say this was a flawed process. This was based on some lies by Mitchell Stark. Mitchell Stark has now effectively admitted to those lies. That's the only reason that David Warner was a part of it, because of Mitchell Stark. It wasn't even because of Cameron Bancroft. Cameron Bancroft didn't mention David Warner until much later in the process. It was Mitchell Stark who framed David Warner. And, I suppose Mitchell Stark doing that, you can understand why he did. He wanted to protect himself from potentially getting unfairly punished. And I think there was a bit of a fear in Stark that if he didn't do something like that, then he could be facing a year-long ban or a lengthy ban, because he already knew at that stage Cameron Bancroft was looking at a year-long ban, maybe longer. And he was like, no, I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to take the fall when all I did was scuff up the ball a bit, which the umpires didn't even think was tampering. So why should he face that penalty? And you can kind of understand that from that point of view, but it was also unfair for Stark to do that. And it was completely unfair for Warner to take the blame. A proper investigation should have cleared Warner and should have said, well, Stark was lying, and we should have had Bancroft, Stark, and yes, Smith a little bit. They're the only ones penalised. So that third person should have been Stark, not Warner. And the fourth one should have been Lehman. Because Lehman, at the minimum, showed an error of judgment. Now, I'm not saying big bans for Stark. Oh, one or two matches, that's all it's warranted. Because the investigation shouldn't have taken that seriously. It was ridiculous to take it that seriously. And Smith, again, the ICC ban of one match was enough. was an error in judgment from Smith, similar to the error in judgment from um, Lehman, which says that Smith should have lost the captaincy. Because if Smith's looking at that, he should have gone there, checked the footage, and said, "Hey, look, you use sandpaper." And when Bancroft's lying to him, he should have said, "No, you speak to the press conference, not me." And if Smith had Bancroft speak to the press conference, and even if Smith had told that nonsense lie about being sticky tape, Smith was fine. It's an error of judgment from Smith, but I think it warranted losing the captaincy. If they want to enforce that loss of the captaincy with a 1 year ban, I think that would have been fair enough. I think even without the official 1 year ban from the captaincy, he probably wouldn't have been captain again for a while. And certainly he should have lost the captaincy for that, because that's a massive error of judgment. And certainly Darren Lehman should have lost the coaching over his massive error of judgment. And I guess there is an argument to say, well, Warner should have chosen better words. And that was an error of judgment. Maybe. But what should his penalty be? Not a year out of the game for first class and test level and a permanent ban on captaincy. That is ridiculous for him saying, well, guys, all of you, really, you all knew about it. Now, as for, we know Warner's coach has recently gone on record and said, well, everyone was told to tamper with the ball. I don't know what that means, but I think it probably was referring to, Stark and Cummins. I don't think that was referring to Bancroft. I think Bancroft might have listened to that and then taken that on board, but I think it was more to do with Stark and Cummins. Hazelwood doesn't seem to have tampered with the ball, and I can't imagine Nathan Lyon bothering because he's a spin bowler. Why would it make a difference? But yeah, we know that Stark and Cummins did a little bit. Whether it reached that threshold of ball tampering, it doesn't seem to have. But it was changing the condition of the ball within acceptable limits, probably. But certainly the South African newspapers said that they had been tampering the ball. And we forget that bit. So when we look at this, it's really important to look at the whole everything and not just jump to conclusions, because a lot of people that have said Warner's to blame, they just took headlines and just jumped to conclusions. Warner is not to blame. I'm not saying Warner did nothing wrong, because arguably Warner should have thought for a second and gone, oh, probably shouldn't be upsetting Stark and making the whole team hate me. Probably should be just keeping my mouth shut. And so I think there is a lesson there. But whether that lesson warranted a year out of the game and a permanent captaincy ban, I don't think so. I certainly don't agree with that. I think it was more, he should have made an apology to the team later on and maybe got a fine. Maybe even a one-match ban internally for that. Not a year out of the game. The level was extraordinary for that. And the lies told about him are extraordinary, and it's unfair. So, I don't necessarily love David Warner, who's my favourite cricketer right now. I love Glenn Maxwell. He's one of my favourites right now. I don't mind David Warner. I like Steve Smith. Certainly he's one of my favourite players right now. I like Josh Hazlewood. Yeah, I like a lot of different Australian players. I like Usman Khawaja sometimes. Sometimes I don't like him, but sometimes I like him. But it's not a matter of who you like or don't like. And look, I quite like Mitchell Stark. I just don't like what he did here. And I think if we take out Mitchell Stark's outburst, David Warner would not have been punished. I think Mitchell Stark owes David Warner a massive apology. I know he's already given one, but I think he owes a little bit more than that. Anyway, but it is the worst part about this is the infighting that it caused within the team and how fans have reacted to the Australian cricket team. And I think that we do need to tell the truth about this, even if it is something we're a bit worried about the implications of. I think we have to. We just have to tell the truth about the whole thing. Not this limited story that puts it all the blame on one person, but everything in context. Say every single thing. Like I have. Said every single thing. Anyway, you've got to put things in proper context or else you get the wrong result. Anyway, that's it from me. Bye bye now.